is Sandy Jeffs. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1976, when it was considered something from which you could not recover. In the 1980s, she was among the first wave of people who started speaking publicly about living with a mental illness. Much of her writing has been about her struggle with schizophrenia. Sandy has published 8 volumes of poetry and co-authored with Margaret Leggatt Out of the Madhouse, From Asylums to Caring Community. In 2021, her musings on the pandemic were published in The Poetics of a Plague, a Haiku Diary, and her memoir, Flying with Paper Wings, Reflections on Living with Madness, was published recently in March 2024. Sandy will be talking about living with schizophrenia, finding hope, purpose and meaning and creativity, and having a place to call home, based on her memoir, Flying with Paper Wings. So I'm just briefly going to pick up the books and show them to you. This is Sandy's cover of Sandy's book. And now I'm going to pass over to Sandy.
Thanks for having me on this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope what I have to say makes sense to people. It's hard to make sense of schizophrenia in a world where, well, I'm conscious of speaking about schizophrenia in the wake of Joel Couchy and the Bondi Junction stabbings. We only hear about schizophrenia when someone does something really bad. And that's endlessly frustrating for someone who's lived with the diagnosis for now 48 years. And you can have 50 fabulous stories of people living well with their schizophrenia. And it takes one PR disaster and all those stories are wiped away because in the public's consciousness and the public's idea of schizophrenia, they associate us with mass murderers and ex-murderers and knife-wielding people and bad things. So I'm conscious that in the wake of that shadow, I'm talking about this rather controversial subject, this controversial diagnosis. In psychiatry, there's a lot of speculation and ideation and controversy over diagnostic labels. And schizophrenia has for a long time been a very controversial diagnosis and diagnostic label. There are those who believe in it as a diagnosis, those who don't. And we know that psychiatry sits on very shaky ground and that a psychiatric diagnosis can lead you down a pathway of a merry-go-round of different diagnostic criteria. I suppose for me, schizophrenia explained to me my bad behaviour when I was in my 20s. It explained to me what was happening in my head. It gave me an understanding of what I was doing and perhaps why I was doing it. So at 23, being diagnosed, a pivotal time of your life when you're trying to get into adulthood, when you're supposed to be getting a career happening, when you're supposed to be doing adult things. And in a way, the diagnosis infantilized me. It led me down a pathway to nothingness. I went from a student with potential, perhaps potential may have been an illusion, I don't know, but I supposedly had potential with a studentship at university, then going on to the dole because I couldn't get a job because I was unraveling, to then getting unwell and going on sickness benefits, to then being put on the invalid pension in 1978. So in a way, my pathway was spiralling downwards to nowhere. And I remember at the time, young, impressionable, wanting to do things. I remember watching all my friends around me getting on with their lives, like Susan and my friends and my 2 partners, Robbie and Dido, all getting into PhDs and all getting into academia and doing fantastic things. And as much as I lauded and loved their successes, for me it highlighted my failure because I wasn't doing anything. I was lying in bed doing nothing. So the death sentence I was given by the clinicians at the time was a really pessimistic moment in my life. And in a way, that death sentence that I was given, I bought into the pessimism myself. And I expected myself to have no hopes, no prospects, no career, nothing. I really had no thought that I could achieve anything now because my life was over. And that pessimism really seeped into my life big time, because I didn't expect much from myself. I didn't do much. So what was happening? What was this schizophrenia? Well, I was hearing voices in my head that nobody else could hear. There were voices who were denigrating me, persecuting me, making me suspicious of my friends, making me suspicious of the world, making me feel unsafe in the world. A constant hounding and harassing of how bad I was, how evil I was as a person, and being caught by delusions, wrapped up in delusions. Delusions being fixed, firm beliefs not based in reality, which is the clinical way of describing them, but they are having a raft of beliefs and ideas that are not based in reality, which lead you down a very, very murky path into a strange place where nothing is as it seems and nothing is real. So being caught in a delusional world, being caught up in voices, having visual hallucinations of the Virgin Mary, and I'm not a Catholic, but I had Catholic visions. What can I say? It really was a strange place to find myself, and a place that I didn't expect to be when I was going through university. And that loss of hope, loss of purpose, loss of meaning in my life was so profound that I remember I described myself as being a nobody and walking in the shadows of others and casting none of my own. That's how invisible I felt as a person. And that invisibility was awful. I remember I would let myself be swayed by other people's opinions because I was so afraid to have opinions of my own. I felt so invisible and such as a non-person that who was I to have an opinion? Who was I to have a belief? Who was I to have any thoughts that were independent and creative? So all this was going on as a 23-year-old. And it meant that in those days, admission to a psych hospital wasn't for days or weeks; it was for months. And my first admission was a month in the Queen Victoria Psych Ward in Lonsdale Street, then 3 months in Parkville Psychiatric Unit, and then I had further episodes after that, and spending time in good old Larundel Psychiatric Hospital, a big madhouse on the edge of town. It had about 800 and 900 beds when I was there. It was huge. It was a very impersonal place. It was a custodial place, but it was where I had the best psychiatric nursing, because the nurses in those days were told to get out into the ward and be with the patients, and they were. So that was so Larundel was interesting. My training at La Trobe had been in anti-psychiatry, and this is interesting because I thought that all nurses in a madhouse were nurse ratched. I thought all the doctors were going to be psychopaths. So when I got to Larundel, I was expecting the worst. I was expecting to see Nurse Ratched in the nurses' station. I was expecting to see Dr. whatever they were as psychopaths who were trying to control my thoughts and ideas and control me as a person. And the funny thing was that when I got to Larundel, I didn't see Nurse Ratched. She wasn't there. The nurses were kind and considerate, and I had good nursing. And the doctors, even though they weren't psychopaths, I don't think they were there to intentionally harm people or to be horrible to people. But I think the thing was that, in a way, it was an institution, and they became unwitting controllers of your life, because they would control how long you stayed there, how long your admission was. So even though I expected the worst, it wasn't always the worst. In a way, Larundel gave me asylum, in a way that psych wards now don't give people asylum. So that was interesting in itself. So experiencing Larundel, a place of extremes, a place of a hellhole and sanctuary all at once, you can't be there. You can't go to Larundel and not be affected by what you experience and what you see. And I saw the best and worst of humanity there. I saw the best and worst of myself there. And I have always been affected by what I experienced at Larundel, and it's even seeped into my dream world. I have dreams about Larundel, sometimes scary ones and sometimes benign ones. So all this was happening at the time. But what I did start doing, and was important for me, was that when I was crazy and when I'd been crazy and when I got out of being crazy, I started documenting my madness in poetry, because that was all I could do at the time. I wasn't doing anything else. Except I was learning the viola, though. I was taking music lessons, but I was writing poems. And when I wrote these poems, and I held the poem in my hand on a bit of paper with a bit of scrawled writing on it, that was giving me testimony to my existence. It was telling me I was alive. And in those days when I was a non-person and quite compromised by my mental health condition, nothing else was telling me I was alive except those poems that I wrote. They were my evidence that I still existed, and I needed to have that evidence. Otherwise, I would have completely fallen away. So I had the poems, and I kept writing the poems. I kept writing and writing, and then eventually I showed them to Susan. In 1993, she said, "I'd like to publish your poems in a book." And that was for me a revelation, because I hadn't been published before. No one knew me. It was a huge chance that Susan took, and Poems from the Madhouse was born. And that was and almost overnight, I went from someone with no hope, no purpose, no meaning, Sandy schizophrenia, to Sandy poet with hope, purpose, and meaning. And I can't say enough how important being creative and seeing myself as being creative was. That I had an imagination still that hadn't been wiped out by all the drugs that I'd been given and wiped out by my schizophrenia. So just having that is so important for me, that I was still capable of imagining things, of bringing into being a poem from nowhere except my imagination. That was a revelation. And I kept writing. So since then I've kept writing. And not that I'm a capital W writer. I don't see myself, I still feel like a fake writer. But I've had 11 books published in total. And my memoir, writing that was interesting, because I sort of asked the question, what's more egocentric, writing a memoir or having a psychotic episode? Because in both instances, I am the centre of my own universe. And that's interesting in itself, because in psychosis, you are the centre of your own universe. All that's happening is happening in your mind. It's all about you and what's happening. So writing a memoir was fascinating. It was a good thing to do, because I could process a lot of stuff. I could process my family. I came from a family of domestic violence. I came from sexual assault at 13. I was actually primed to go crazy at 23. So much had happened to me in my younger life that the trauma background was feeding into my insecurity as a 20-year-old, and that sort of bred into my psychosis. So processing all that in my book has been really important, and trying to understand what my parents meant to me, given they were so dysfunctional and so hateful in their relationship, what that meant, how could I process that? And writing my memoir was one way of processing it, processing my madness, processing my life. And when you write a memoir, you have to sort of identify things in your life that are important, things that you think were the building blocks of what made you who you are now. And that was interesting to actually try and identify the signifiers of my life that were worth writing about. So I'm so glad. I mean, I said the book is a miracle. If I tried to write it again now, it would be a different book. I'm sure I wouldn't. I mean, I don't know how I've dragged up all these memories and where they came from. Am I having a memory of a memory? Is memory? Is there veracity in memory? Is what I've remembered true, or is it fake? Is it delusional? I don't know, but it seems important that I've written it down. And when I see it in black and white in print, it gives it another dimension, a really, really strange dimension, because I think, gee, I've written all these words. Where did they come from? This baby that I've given birth to, how did I give birth to it? How on earth did I do it? So I'm just going to read a little bit from the memoir just to finish, because I reflected on my parents, because I've written the beginning of it is about my parents and their domestic violence and my mother's alcoholism, which is really sad and horrible to have to live through. But I sort of reflected on my parents and reflected on me as a younger person. How is it? I'll just read it and let you know. You'll see what I have written. When I reread this memoir, I was struck by how sad it is. So much has happened to me over a long period of time. I've been thinking a lot lately about my parents and realised I never really understood or appreciated how miserable they must have been in their awful relationship. How my mother's drinking was perhaps a result of her being trapped in a situation over which she had no control and couldn't easily leave. She had no education or financial independence. Her drinking may have been a form of self-medication to ease her unhappiness. Maybe she was depressed and never received the care she needed. My mother and father were so tragic. I wonder, two people caught up in a web of hate and self-destruction. I wonder, did they ever ask themselves what their bad behaviour was doing to their children? What I witnessed never goes away. So how do I feel about them now? After years of unresolved, conflicting emotions, I see them through sorrowful eyes from a safe distance. Even though I'm still affected by their legacy and I can dissolve into a deep melancholy when horrific memories flood my senses, I am less distressed and able to see that that was then and I am in the now, a better now. If only my younger, troubled self, who carried the weighty baggage of childhood trauma, who was condemned all those years ago to irretrievable madness, had had a crystal ball in which to see the future, to know that it would be all right. So I'm in a much better place now than I was 48 years ago, and the journey through those years has been pretty torturous much of the time. But I've had my poetry, my writing, my team Sandy. I've had my friends. I've had my music. I've had a lot of things to be proud of and to be grateful for, because a lot of my mad comrades don't have the privilege of a team around them to support them, or the privilege of having things like creativity and a purpose and hope, purpose and meaning. So I thank a lot of people for getting me to where I am now, and I can't thank Susan enough either for that initial publication which changed my life.
I should also add that Sandy's book, Poems from the Madhouse, is Spinifex's best-selling poetry book. In fact, it's up among the bestsellers of all books. So, well done for a non-poet.